I'm finding like new ways, and just a little lick here and a little bit there, and Charlie and I said, wish we'd have put that on the record, you know.
Yeah.
But the fact is that the way things go, you wrote songs, and 5 days later, you recorded it.
It's hard to imagine now, but the most famous song the Rolling Stones ever released almost slipped through their fingers. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because it arrived at the wrong moment, in the wrong way, when no one was fully awake, fully confident, or fully in control. The story we've been told is simple: a legendary riff, a quick recording, a hit that changed rock music forever. But when you slow things down and look closer, the truth feels far more unstable, messier, almost accidental. In 1965, the Rolling Stones weren't chasing perfection. They were chasing survival, endless tours, constant pressure, a growing fear that if they didn't deliver another hit fast, everything they'd built could start slipping away. Inside the band, tension was quietly building. Different visions, different instincts, different ideas of what the next step should be. And then, in the middle of that pressure, something strange happened. A sound appeared not in a studio, not during a writing session, but in a half-asleep moment that wasn't meant to last. No planning, no discussion, just instinct. What followed wasn't a carefully crafted masterpiece. It was a narrow, creative window, a moment so brief that no one had time to overthink it. And that's where the legend begins. Because the biggest question isn't whether the song was recorded in 15 minutes. It's why, once that moment passed, it could never happen the same way again. But to understand that, we have to go back to where the tension really started. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. By the time 1965 arrived, the Rolling Stones were already famous, but they didn't feel secure. Fame came fast, but it came with expectations that never slowed down. Every new release had to prove something. Every song had to hit harder than the last. Inside the band, the cracks were subtle but real. Mick was becoming sharper, more confrontational with his lyrics. He wanted songs that felt dangerous, songs that reflected frustration, desire, and control. Keith, on the other hand, was exhausted. Night after night on the road had blurred into one long stretch of noise, hotels, and sleeplessness. Creativity wasn't flowing, it was leaking out in fragments. There were disagreements about direction, about sound, about whether simplicity was a strength or a sign of running out of ideas. No one said it out loud, but the pressure was there. The next song mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. What made things worse was time, or the lack of it. Studio sessions were rushed. Writing happened between flights and hotel rooms. There was no luxury to sit and refine ideas for weeks. If something didn't work fast, it was abandoned just as quickly. That environment didn't encourage careful planning. It rewarded instinct, and sometimes instinct shows up when you're least prepared to notice it. Late one night, far from any studio, that instinct finally broke through, not as a finished song, but as a sound that almost vanished before anyone realized what it was. And the strange part? The person who created it barely remembered doing it at all. The moment didn't feel important at first. In fact, it barely felt real. Keith was alone in a hotel room in Florida, somewhere between exhaustion and sleep. The kind of night where your mind drifts without permission. Ideas surface, then disappear before you can grab onto them. He wasn't trying to write a song. He wasn't chasing a hit. He was just reacting to a sound echoing in his head. Half awake, he reached for a small cassette recorder. No studio microphones, no bandmates, no conversation about structure or intention. Just a guitar, a rough idea, and a few instinctive minutes before sleep pulled him back under. What the tape captured was brief. A raw, repeating riff. No polish, no confidence, just repetition, and then silence. Or almost silence, the faint sound of breathing as he drifted fully asleep. By morning, the moment felt distant. When Keith listened back, it didn't strike him as revolutionary. It sounded unfinished, maybe even disposable. Another fragment among dozens he'd already forgotten. There was a real chance the tape would be erased. Space was limited. New ideas needed room. This one didn't announce itself as special. That's what makes this moment dangerous. History tells us the riff changed everything, but at the time, it didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like nothing. And that's where the tension deepens, because once the band finally heard it, opinions immediately split, not about whether it was catchy, but about what it was supposed to become. And that disagreement would push the song into a risky direction no one fully agreed on. When the band finally listened to the tape, the reaction wasn't explosive. It was cautious, almost dismissive. The riff didn't arrive with confidence or explanation, it just repeated itself, demanding attention without asking permission. In a group already drowning in half-finished ideas, that was dangerous. Everyone had fragments, everyone had demos, and not all of them could be saved. Decisions had to be fast. Brutal, sometimes. If something didn't immediately prove its worth, it was pushed aside. Keith himself wasn't convinced. To him, the riff felt too simple, too bare. There was no clear destination yet, no obvious chorus, just tension looping in circles. In another moment, under less pressure, it might have been set aside for later, or erased entirely to make room for something more serious. That uncertainty exposed a deeper issue inside the band. Who decided what mattered? Mick heard something confrontational in the sound, a pulse that matched the irritation already living in his lyrics. Others weren't so sure. Some felt it lacked elegance. Others worried it sounded unfinished, even aggressive. The room didn't fill with excitement, it filled with hesitation. And that hesitation mattered, because once an idea is questioned, it becomes fragile. One wrong comment, one impatient decision, and the moment disappears. What saved the riff wasn't confidence, it was timing. There simply wasn't time to argue it to death. The band needed something now, and this was already there, staring them in the face. But how it would be recorded was another battle entirely. The argument didn't start with lyrics, it started with tone. Keith plugged into a fuzz pedal, something he barely trusted himself. The distortion was harsh, compressed, almost crude. In his mind, it wasn't meant to stay, it was a placeholder. A rough guide that would eventually be replaced by something cleaner, maybe even more traditional. But once the sound filled the room, it changed everything. Some heard power, others heard chaos. Mick wasn't sure if the aggression helped or distracted from the message. There were quiet disagreements, not shouting matches, but sharp looks and unresolved silences. Was this sound too much, or was that exactly the point? The tension wasn't technical, it was philosophical. One side believed the song needed refinement to survive on the radio. The other felt the rawness was the song. Strip it away, and you'd lose the frustration that made it feel alive. No one fully won the argument, and that's what made the next decision so risky. Instead of stopping to debate, they recorded anyway, quickly, almost impulsively. No long discussions, no endless takes. The fuzz stayed not because everyone agreed, but because no one stopped it in time. That decision locked the song into a version no one had planned to keep. And suddenly, the clock mattered. Not because they were counting minutes, but because once the tape was rolling, instinct took over. There was no space left for second thoughts. And in that narrow window, the song became something none of them could fully control. The recording didn't feel monumental, it felt rushed. There weren't endless takes or careful refinements. The structure was already there. The riff didn't change. The groove settled almost immediately. Everyone played as if this was still a draft, something they'd return to later and improve once the pressure eased. That's the illusion that makes this moment so dangerous. Because what they captured happened quickly. Not in a literal countdown, but in a creative blink. Before doubts could pile up, before opinions could harden into arguments. The band locked into the sound, the frustration, the tension, and then it was done. No one announced it as final. No one celebrated. In fact, some members felt uneasy. The track sounded exposed. The distortion felt unresolved. The performance wasn't polished. That discomfort mattered. It meant the song wasn't overthought into safety. The strange truth is this. Had they slowed down, the song might have changed completely. The fuzz could have been removed, the edges smoothed out, the urgency diluted, and the thing that made it unforgettable might have vanished with it. That's why the idea of 15 minutes refuses to die. Not because the clock proves anything, but because the song belongs to a moment so brief it couldn't be recreated. And even after the recording stopped, the band still didn't agree on what they'd just made. Because the most controversial decision was still ahead. Once the recording was finished, the unease didn't disappear. It intensified. Mick listened closely to the track, focusing on the words. To him, the song sounded like a provocation, a voice pushing back against control, frustration, and expectation. The simplicity of the structure worked in his favor. It left space for the message to cut through. Keith heard something else entirely. He fixated on the sound. The fuzz still bothered him. It felt temporary, like a sketch that accidentally made it onto the canvas. He wasn't convinced the track represented what the band should sound like when it mattered most. This wasn't just a disagreement about tone, it was about control, about instinct versus intention, about whether the Stones were becoming sharper by accident or losing discipline on purpose. No one stormed out. No dramatic ultimatums were thrown around. The conflict lived in silence, in unfinished sentences, and decisions left hanging, and that made it more dangerous. Because unresolved tension doesn't disappear, it waits. The strange part was that both men were right. The song worked because it balanced aggression with restraint, but neither of them fully trusted that balance. What tipped the scale wasn't another argument between bandmates. It was the intervention of someone outside the emotional storm, someone willing to take a gamble they weren't ready to make themselves. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. The final call didn't come from the band. Andrew Loog Oldham listened to the track and saw something the others were still debating. He didn't hear a rough draft. He heard urgency, a sound that felt uncomfortable because it was supposed to. And that discomfort, to him, was the entire point. Releasing the song as it was meant taking risks. The lyrics were confrontational, the sound was distorted, the energy was tense. Radio stations could reject it, critics could dismiss it as sloppy, and the band itself wasn't unified behind it. But hesitation was the real enemy. Oldham understood something crucial. If they waited, the moment would be gone. The song belonged to that exact version, not a cleaner one, not a safer one. Change it, and it would lose the edge that made it dangerous. So, he pushed forward. For some members of the band, the decision felt premature. For others, it felt relieving. The argument was over, whether they'd won it or not. That's how quickly history can lock into place. Not with confidence, not with consensus, but with momentum. Once the single was sent out, the band had no control left. The world would decide what the song meant, and whether that chaotic, rushed moment was brilliance or a mistake they'd regret. They didn't have to wait long to find out. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The song didn't climb quietly, it exploded. Radios couldn't ignore it. Audiences didn't analyze it, they felt it. The distorted riff that almost didn't survive became instantly recognizable. The frustration in the lyrics spoke to something people hadn't heard so openly before. Success arrived faster than the band could process it. But inside, the silence was telling. Victory didn't erase the tension that had shaped the song. If anything, it confirmed it. The version Keith doubted, the sound Mick questioned. The recording that felt unfinished, that was the one the world embraced. There was irony in that. The song born from pressure became proof that instinct mattered more than perfection. That hesitation could be more dangerous than risk. And yet, no one celebrated the way you might expect. The band moved on quickly, already chasing the next moment, the next song, the next impossible expectation. There was no time to reflect on how close they'd come to losing this one. That's how myths form. A rushed decision becomes a defining moment. A narrow creative window turns into legend. But the most important part isn't how fast the song was recorded. It's that once that moment passed, it could never be recreated. And that's why this story still matters. Over time, the story began to shift. Details blurred. Minutes turned into legend. People started repeating the same line again and again, that the Rolling Stones' biggest song was recorded in just 15 minutes. Taken literally, it sounds impossible. But myths rarely survive because they're precise. They survive because they point to something deeper. The truth is more uncomfortable. The song wasn't rushed by a stopwatch. It was rushed by circumstance, by exhaustion, by disagreement, by a band that didn't have the emotional space to overthink what it was doing. That's what the myth is really protecting. The idea arrived in minutes. The decision to record it happened before doubt could take over, and the version the world knows was captured before anyone felt brave enough to stop it. That window was small, fragile, and once it closed, it never opened the same way again. That's why no later version could replace it. No cleaner take, no refined arrangement. The tension that created the song existed only in that exact moment when the band was divided, unsure, and moving too fast to interfere with instinct. The myth refuses to fade because it reminds us of something uncomfortable about creativity. Sometimes the greatest things don't come from control, they come from letting go before fear has time to speak. And that realization still unsettles people today. If this story changed the way you hear this song even slightly, take a second to like the video. If you believe moments like this don't happen in music anymore, leave a comment. I want to hear your take. And if you want more stories where rock history almost went the wrong way, subscribe to the channel. These moments deserve to be remembered. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize what happened, to believe the band knew exactly what they were doing, that they recognized the importance of the moment as it unfolded. They didn't. What made this song immortal wasn't confidence, it was uncertainty, a band under pressure, a sound born half asleep, a decision made before everyone agreed, and a recording captured before perfection had time to interfere. That's why it still feels alive. Today, music is planned, tested, refined, optimized, and in that process, moments like this become rare. Not because musicians lack talent, but because they rarely allow chaos to lead the way. The biggest song the Rolling Stones ever released wasn't carefully built. It slipped through during a moment no one was guarding. And once it escaped, it changed everything. Not in 15 minutes on a clock, but in a creative instant that history can never recreate.